Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Zoe and I'm really excited to make this video today because I am currently studying comparative literature, and one of my favorite modules from last term was all about topics in modern literary fiction. Now, we covered a lot of books, but I only wanted to share the ones that I can genuinely recommend and that have really stuck with me. As you may know, literary fiction is a genre that focuses more on theme and characters over plot. It doesn't follow typical tropes. Instead, it explores the human condition, often touching on social, psychological, and political questions. Basically, these are the kinds of books that leave you thinking long after you finished reading them. And in this video, I wanted to show you 4 of my favorites. So the first is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. Now, this is my favorite of the list. It follows the story of an ordinary woman named Young-hae, at least I think that's how you pronounce her name, please correct me and let me know if not, who lives a perfectly uneventful, quiet life until she one day decides to become a vegetarian. Now, this is a minor decision and one that you might have expected from the name of the book, but one that ultimately leads to her descending into what can only be described as insanity. What makes this book so fascinating is that we never actually hear the main character, Young-hae's voice, throughout most of the story. Instead, her story is told from 3 different characters, 3 different narrators, and it's these different perspectives of people close to her, yet all 3 of which can never seem to really understand her, that creates a sense of distance and mystery throughout the story. As the reader, you're left constantly trying to piece together what is actually happening, and more importantly, how it's come to all of this. We're also given very little information about Young-hae herself. Instead, we're fed fragments of dreams, memories, and stories from unreliable narrators who make her descent into something unrecognizable seem even more disorientating. There are a lot of strong psychological themes in this book, and as I love books that explore themes of the unconscious mind and its darker tendencies, there's a lot to unpack in this one. Now, without giving anything of the story away, it really made me reflect on questions like, is being a predator part of our human nature? Can we ever truly escape our violent impulses, or do they just turn into something else when repressed? And also, what happens when someone tries to escape their humanity and the violence inherent in it by rejecting their desire, aggression, even the body itself? Is that liberation, or does it become something darker? There's something almost mythic in the way that the book explores these questions, and it doesn't give you any easy answers. The narrative stays very ambiguous and open to interpretation, which I think makes it all the more powerful. I will say, though, it's not necessarily an easy read, so I do want to offer a content warning for anyone sensitive to psychological distress and violence, but it's honestly one of the most unique and thought-provoking books I have read in a while. I first read this in 2 days, and to be honest, it did give me some nightmares for a few days after, and for a while I also felt a bit queasy about eating meat, but it is a book that I've been thinking about ever since I finished reading it, and I am currently rereading it actually, and really going through it this time to take a lot more notes. But if you're into literature that explores the darker aspects of the human psyche and challenges your beliefs about what it means to be human, then I cannot recommend this enough. Next on the list is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. Now, this was an unforgettable read, not because I enjoyed reading it, but because it made me sit with such an intense discomfort that I couldn't shake off. I honestly hated reading it, but I think that was kind of the point. The story is told in 2 distinct parts. The first follows a group of Israeli soldiers in 1949 in the Negev desert near the Egyptian border. And I want to especially put another trigger warning here because the first part was, in my opinion, the hardest to read. It's very uncomfortable. There's violence, illness, madness, all unfolding with an eerie sense of detachment and dread that makes it a bit of a tough read. And if I didn't have to read this, then I probably would have quit. But now, looking back, I am in fact glad that I read the whole thing. The second part of the story jumps forward in time, and it follows a Palestinian woman who, by chance, stumbles across the events that happened earlier in the story in a newspaper. This seemingly minor detail, given that she is experiencing so much violence and destruction in just her day-to-day life, would have usually been overlooked, but it just so happens that the events happened on the same day as her birthday, and this is what catches her attention. And it's this one eerie coincidence that sends her spiraling into obsession as she tries to uncover the truth behind something that history has tried to erase. Thematically, the book dives deep into issues such as power, occupation, borders, and erasure. And what really stuck with me is how the narrative refuses to dramatize or sensationalize the violence that it depicts. Instead, it has this very cold and detached perspective, especially in the first part, which makes the horror of the story feel all the more strange and visceral to the reader. The story's narrative is at times very repetitive and methodical, and it doesn't actually let you get too close to any of the characters. Instead, it keeps you at a distance and you're only an observer. Now, the writing in the book is incredible. In fact, one of my first thoughts was how Shibli has such a talent and she seems to be using it in the worst way. Obviously, I'm joking here because it's a great book, but she writes very visceral descriptions that really focus on the senses, smells, sights, bodily sensations, and she has such a skill in doing this that it was the only book on the list that has actually made me feel physically ill while reading it on the train. So it has been a really tough one at some parts because of this. And also during the first part of this book, I actually had to put it down for a few days and actively avoid thinking about it or anything before I could come back because it was a bit of a tough read at times. While reading, you really feel like you're being pulled through something you're not meant to witness, and yet you can't look away. There are also so many overlapping themes of violence in the book that in our class analysis, we are just constantly drawing parallels between the first and the second part of the book. Even though they're entirely different stories, they seem to mirror each other in a way, perhaps highlighting the cyclical nature of violence and the ongoing conflict. And something important I want to add is that I will never call a book bad just because I didn't enjoy reading it. A bad book to me is only a book that I can walk away from and never think about again. Minor detail, however, haunted me. It left me feeling unsettled, uncomfortable. It's led to so many thoughts and conversations with others just because of some of the themes this book touches on. And it is because of that this is a book I absolutely recommend, especially if you're into literature that confronts difficult histories and the politics of memories, then this is a really interesting read. Now, next up is The Metamorphosis or Die Verwandlung by Franz Kafka. Now, this was my first time reading The Metamorphosis in English, and even though the story is one that is very familiar to me, something about reading it in this translation or this version gave it a very different feeling. Kafka was known to be very picky about translations of his work, and one thing I find so sweet is that his lover, Milena, and that this relationship they had all started because she was the one to translate his works from German into Czech. And he read this and for the first time really felt understood and seen by another person because she was able to translate his work in a way that was so close and similar to what he was trying to express through it that he just fell in love with her from the moment he read her words and adored her his whole life. So this shows that I think when reading Kafka, it's good to just be aware about how intentional he apparently was in the words and the phrasing that he would use when writing. Although Kafka is known to disregard too interpretive readings of his work, I think there are still many points that are really interesting to look at and interpret more closely. For example, one of the first lines in the book describes Gregor, the main character, as waking up one morning transformed into a monstrous sort of vermin. Now, in the original German, this is ein ungeheures Ungeziefer, and Ungeziefer, as the word for vermin, has its root in an old German word, which describes a creature that is not fit for sacrifice. So, in other words, Gregor awakes one morning no longer fit to sacrifice himself for his family, the way that he had previously been living all of his life, and we see this because there's almost nothing of Gregor in the story. And this is why it's so tragic, because even when he awakes one morning transformed into an insect, his first thought and worry is about being late to work, not making his train. And no one in the story ever seems to acknowledge the absolute absurdity of the whole situation. And this is what strikes me the most, how Kafka creates a tragedy not through loss, but through creating a character that never had a self to begin with. Gregor is so consumed by his duties to his family, to his work, that even when he wakes one morning transformed into something completely inhuman, his first thought is about missing work. His first thought is about his responsibilities and duties that he has. And I find there's a kind of heartbreaking irony in that, because he never questions the absurdity. He doesn't rage, he doesn't rebel. This is what makes us think that his transformation into an Ungeziefer is symbolic of some deeper truth, that he was already dehumanized long before he actually turned into an insect. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Even when he becomes something so grotesque, he never stops trying to perform the role that is expected of him. I mentioned this a bit in my video about modern tragedies, as I believe Kafka's Metamorphosis is a wonderful example of this. In modern tragedies, the hero's suffering is often self-inflicted, forcing the audience to reflect on their own complicity in their own suffering. The modern tragedy leaves us questioning, why has it come to this? Why did it have to end this way? Because compared to, for example, Greek tragedies, where everything was dictated by fate and the gods and external forces that were not in our control, the whole point of the modern tragedy is that we have free will. We have control and we can change, and yet we don't. And that is what pushes us to reflect and to go inwards and to ask ourselves, why? And in Metamorphosis, we can look at Gregor and we can recognize all of these little flaws that have led to his downfall. And even worse, we see that even though the ending could have been avoidable, it was inevitable because he was never going to change. One interpretation I quite like is that of Nabokov, who was a big fan of insects, and he claims to have identified the type of bug that Gregor had been transformed into. And this was some type of cockroach that actually had wings, and this is where the whole symbolism of the open window in his room may have been important, because if this is true, then he would have been able to escape the whole time. He might have flown away if only the idea of escape had been imaginable to him. Instead, he remains trapped, not just physically, but also mentally, as he's shackled by his identity, and it's this tension that makes Kafka's absurdism so powerful. It's funny, bizarre, and tragic all at once. Another thing that came to my mind while reading this is how apparently Kafka used to randomly burst into manic laughter while reading his works out loud to his friends. And this is something that has really stuck in my mind while reading this book, because it really feels at times like his use of the absurd is so comical and infuriating at the same time. And through all of this, I can just imagine Kafka's laughter in the back of my mind, not at Gregor, but at us, at the ways we contort ourselves to fit into systems that were never built with our humanity in mind. But again, this isn't a book that is necessarily meant to be interpreted, so you can read it any way you like, or you can take it as just what it is. Still, it's one of my favorite ones, and I can really recommend this if you want to read another work of Kafka that is even more frustrating and infuriating. Then I can also recommend The Trial, which I can leave in the description if you want to check it out. And the last book on this list is The Autumn of the Patriarch by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Now, of all the books I have had to read for uni last term, this one was probably the least enjoyed by students, and I can honestly understand why. But I think it's absolutely worth reading, especially if you're someone who is drawn to poetic language, experimental writing, and stories that sit somewhere between myth, memory, and madness, because that is exactly what this book is. Now, if you have read 100 Years of Solitude or Love in the Time of Cholera, you may be familiar with Marquez's, unique writing style. I know that when I think back to his other books, some of the ones I've read, I can't tell you anything about the plot and what actually is going on, but I do see these very vivid depictions and almost images that are painted in my mind, and I think this is something that Marquez does incredibly well. Just like some of his other works, I find that The Autumn of the Patriarch has a very surreal and lyrical style. It tells the story, or more accurately, stories, of a godlike dictator who rules over a fictional Caribbean island. The novel opens with a group of people discovering the general's dead body and wondering if he is really actually dead this time, because apparently this isn't the first time they have found his corpse. And from there, the narrative jumps, disorients, shifts, and spirals. Time, place, and perspective all start to bleed into one another, and in a single sentence, which can be several pages long, we shift from I to you to we to he with no punctuation whatsoever to guide you. And it's not just unreliable narration, it's communal and layered storytelling. This book becomes a fragmented tapestry of legends, rumors, myths, superstitions, and some personal stories of all the people who have lived under the general's rule. Some of it is very clearly mythologized and attributes some divine and godlike powers to the general, while others are a lot more intimate and tragic. But despite the brutality of the general, because there is a lot of brutality in this book, there's also a strange sense of sympathy that creeps into the story. All of the people seem to love the general, and they look up to him, and they really treat him like a god. And this is what also pulls the reader into sympathy, because the language can be so beautiful and so poetic that there are many points in the book I actually had to go back pages and reread a whole section because I didn't actually realize what gruesome events were being described underneath it. And this is what I find so fascinating, because you as the reader often don't even realize what's happening because the prose is so hypnotic in the way it's written. While the whole thing feels very surreal and dreamlike, it's actually deeply rooted in history. Marquez draws inspiration from dictators all across Latin America, and a lot of the things that feel so ridiculous and exaggerated in the book to the point of satire are actually echoes of things that have happened in the past. Now, the structure is as ambitious as the story itself. It becomes increasingly difficult to follow, and at a certain point you really have to let go of trying to track anything that's going on in the story and just let it wash over you. And I think this is why it can take some time getting used to in the beginning, because you're not used to the writing style and you're trying to follow what is going on, who is telling it. You often get different layers of the same story being told on top of each other, but telling very different tales from different perspectives. Time is constantly jumping around and one memory weaves into another, and then it takes you to an entirely new place. This kind of sentence structure with extremely long sentences becomes greater and greater as the story goes on, so much so that the last chapter of the book, which is nearly 60 pages, is a single sentence. It's very dense, but it actually flows like poetry, and it reminds me of oral storytelling traditions such as in the Odyssey or the Iliad, where phrases are repeated over and over again to create rhythm and to uphold memory. It honestly took me the first half of this book to get used to the writing, because it can feel so disorienting. You don't know where you are, when you are, who is speaking, who the story is about, but eventually you get used to it and you just have to relax and experience the story for what it is, and that is when it becomes so beautiful and mesmerizing. And as someone who loves German, where longer and winding sentence structures are a lot more common, I actually found it really satisfying to read once I got a bit more adjusted to it. And I also was really wondering how much of these longer sentence structures may be influenced by Spanish, because the translation will definitely affect how it sounds and how it feels to read. So I'd be curious to know if it would feel more or less natural to read in its native tongue. It's not just a novel about a dictator, but it's about memory, power, and language, and how history becomes myth, and how myth then becomes history, how it's all interwoven in one another. And another thing that I really love that our lecturer shared with us is how Marquez himself described The Autumn of the Patriarch as, wait, I've written it down. Let me see if you can see. As a poem about the solitude of power, and I think that is a very beautiful way to read this book, keeping that in mind. Maybe that is where this sense of sympathy comes from throughout the story. It tempts the reader to understand and to sympathize with the general, despite all the ridiculous events that are unfolding, and I'm sure every person reading this will have a very different experience of it. But it's a book I highly recommend, especially if you want to read something that really goes and breaks all the rules of writing. And if you don't have to take an exam on it like I do, I really suggest reading it without worrying about trying to follow perspective, but just reading it for the experience that Marquez's writing creates. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these. I'd also love to know what you've been reading lately too. And if you enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, all the usual things, and I'll see you next time. Bye!